Hello, welcome to God Talk. It's been maybe a couple weeks or so. Continue on with the series. This one's suffering topic. This is kind of a difficult topic because this is very real to many, many people. And it has a mystery to it. And so let's jump in right now. Everyone suffers. People who you think have it all suffer. People who are rich, like in Marin County, uh, San Francisco. Many of them seek psychiatrists or psychologists because they're depressed. They've got everything almost. Um, so that's the rich area. There's the poor. The poor suffer from their needs, their whatever their needs are, food, whatever, suffering. Um, and there's other types of suffering. Anyway, everybody suffers. Some suffer more than others. It's hard to gauge. Especially when you go to the doctor and they say, well, how's the pain level? Well, what may be painful to one person may be not so much pain for another person. So there's levels of suffering. And then finally, some suffer tremendously. Um, they may be what they call suffering saints. We'll talk about that, later. Saint Andre is one of them. But a lot of your saints have suffered tremendously. Obviously, the martyrs, etc. So what types of suffering are there? This is, not limited to these four, but these are just ones I picked out. Suffering caused by your own self, the natural consequences, sin. So, for example, you drink too much and you drive and you get in an accident, and you maybe have to go to jail or you get a license for it. That's an example. Or you commit adultery. You're fooling around with someone's wife. Well, you break up their family and the kids are affected. Some are caused by others. Um, Someone walks up to you and bops you off the head. That seems to be something going on nowadays. Very unusual. It didn't happen before. Why? Why are people doing that? Anyway, it's suffering. It's caused by others. You might get knocked out and have to go to the doctor and all that stuff. Sometimes, and this is often the case, you're not to blame, and others are not to blame. There's no one to blame. So Jesus talks about that, and when he talked about the pillar that fell, and some suggest that, well, they deserved it because they were sinning. Well, no, Jesus corrected them, saying no, it's not that case. Someone who are born with a genetic disease, it's not their fault. They're born with it, and or someone who contracts an illness, being passed on, and some respond positively, some might, die or get seriously ill. Death happens to everybody. And that's a tremendous cause of suffering. Um, and there's long suffering. This tends to be people who suffer medical or psychological problems. And why are some healed and some are not? There's a great question. It's hard to understand that, but just because I brought it up and it's important, that there's some of the great saints suggest that it's needed, because if we didn't have this form of suffering, we would get into trouble, and then it would lead to sin and would maybe even put us into hell. So, we have this form of suffering which keeps us in check, if you will. That's, in some, for others, and that's, I know some people don't understand that. So, but anyway, that's that one. So, and then finally, volunteer suffering. Now, a lot of people who are Christians, they don't understand that, but it's in the Bible. I mean, recall Nineveh, and the king humbled himself and said to this kingdom, we're going to do sackcloth and ashes to regain God's mercy. Some would argue, well, we don't need to do that anymore because Jesus, is the fulfillment, and that has validity, but not completely. Let's look what the scripture says. So let's start with Luke 14:27, And whoso doesn't carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Well, what does that mean? Wasn't Jesus, many people think, oh, Jesus carried the cross, we don't have to do anything. Well, what does he say here? If you don't carry your own cross, you can't be my disciple. So what does that mean? So he's referring to suffering and other things, but also, just natural consequence of being a disciple. Colossians 1:24, now I rejoice in my sufferings for you. Well, I thought only Jesus suffered, and why is St. Paul saying he's suffering for us? Well, maybe there's something he's talking about. Maybe that his sufferings are for our benefit. Okay? And fill up those that are wanting of the sufferings of Christ in my flesh for his body, which is the church. Now, there's natural suffering. For example, he was whipped, he was shipwrecked, a lot of things, in jail, tortured, whatever. He did a lot of that. But he was doing it for the benefit of the church, so he can keep preaching. But also there's another aspect where he offered up his suffering, in a sense. So let's go to 1 Peter chapter 2. What glory is it if committing a sin and being buffeted for it you endure? In other words, there's no, how do you say it? In a sense of penance. In other words, you do a sin and you get the consequences and you're getting lashed for it. That's a natural consequence. But if you're doing well, in other words, don't sin, and you suffer patiently, this is thankworthy before God. So you endure suffering patiently. For unto this you are called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Well, what does that mean? I thought Christ suffered and that's it. What about me? Do I have to suffer? Well, you're going to suffer anyway. It's part of life. And he's suggesting this is what you do. We are going to suffer. Some Christians don't understand this. So Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example to follow in his steps. Now, we're not going to probably die on a cross. We're not going to be probably under the lash, striped and whipped. We're probably not going to have a crown of thorns put on our heads. That's not the point. The point is we're going to have to suffer a little bit, probably, and we can try to do it with patience and enduring it, offering it up for others and for the church, maybe. So Christ did not sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled, he did not revile. In other words, he didn't return stuff that was done to him onto someone else. There was no revenge at all. And with a blink of an eye, or even a thought, Christ could have stopped everything. He was God, or is God. He's still alive. But when he suffered, he didn't threaten. He delivered himself to be judged unjustly. He just went lamb to the wolves. He just went and allowed himself to be tortured for us. So, and if that's an example that he wants he wants us to carry our crosses. So when we are suffering, for whatever cause, our own, someone else does it, or it's not our control or not anybody's fault. That's something to think about. Let's jump into this blesseds. So this is a combination of Matthew's 5:3 plus and on, in other words, and Luke 6:20 and on. So I combine them. Blessed are the poor, or poor in spirit. Now they're kind of two distinct things, but they're both involved apparently. Poor obviously is without money, and someone who's poor has to rely on what they call divine providence, which a lot of saints do that in terms of their St. Francis, for example, who did that. And Poor in spirit means to be humble. Okay, so sometimes someone might be pretty well off, but they don't show it, and they actually donate a ton to the poor, and they do other things, that kind of thing. So it's not just has to do with wealth, but it does have to do with wealth, because it's a form of suffering. Hunger is a form of suffering, and people who, in the United States is not a common thing. Other parts of the world, they're really hungry, desperately hungry, dying of hunger. All right, and Jesus is saying they're blessed. Now, there are other types of hunger, by the way, but this is, I think, regarding food. Why would they be blessed? Because they're crying out to God. They're giving God attention. And this is important. Those who have everything, or seemingly have everything, don't give God attention. Many of them, and he gave you life. He wants a little bit of attention. So it's just part of the loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Weeping and mourning. This covers everybody. Pretty much weeps and mourns of a death, one lost relationship. Why is he saying blessed? Because again, we reach out to God sometimes in that moment, and he comforts those who mourn. Also, sometimes when people don't carry on their normal way of living, when there's someone who's passed on, they kind of stop and they help. They say prayers for the family, or they send their condolences, and they go to the wake or funeral, and sometimes the family feels very much loved in their mourning process. So there's that kind of neat thing that occurs in this culture anyway, in the United States. Meek, those who are Jesus said, learn from me, for I'm meek and humble of heart. Those who are meek will inherit the earth. Those who hunger and thirst for justice. Mercy, those who are merciful obtain mercy. That is because that's the heart of God, is mercy, love and mercy. And there are people who are just very forgiving. So those who aren't forgiving or have a hard time forgiving, I understand hard time forgiving, but you got to just try to keep at it, just forgive and forgive. But those who just start to have a revengeful heart, that's not going to lead anywhere. So if you're merciful, that's the best way. Clean of heart means purity. You see God when you have clean heart. Peacemakers, those who are trying to be peaceful, trying to maintain peace, try to prevent fighting, try to prevent evil, from rearing its head. Those who suffer persecution for justice' sake, and also those who, when they revile you, persecute on behalf of Jesus. In other words, because you're a Christian, whatever branch you are, Christians have their set of values, and woe to those who are rich, that kind of thing. Those who are filled. This refers more to food. This is something hard in the United States culture because we have a ton of food here. So, like in places where they don't have food, they're always hungry. Those who laugh. Obviously, it's okay to laugh. I think I will say this: making fun of someone is not a great way to laugh, unless it's a form of banter. Okay, that like Irish tend to banter a little bit, and it's a form of play, and sometimes it can go over the top, but it's a form of play, and that I get that. But really laughing at someone or a group of people, or now there's a thing called self-deprecated humor, laughing at oneself. The problem is some people perceive that as you have low sense of I don't know what to say, confidence. And that's not necessarily the case. It's just a form of humor so you don't offend other people. Situational humor is probably the best, because it's a situation and people can relate to it. There's no, you're not laughing at somebody. It's more you're laughing at the situation. Um, but he's also, you can't live your life always laughing and laughing. You got to be somewhat serious and take salvation, seriously. Your soul's at hand. Um, so I don't know if that helps with that whole thing, but because you don't want to be crying all the time, right? So just take a look at men who bless you and praise you. Finally, a special calling. So regarding long suffering, let me just bring up one example. There are lots and lots. Saint Andre was a man in Canada who was short in stature, and from his birth, they didn't know if he was going to make it because he suffered tremendously of different ailments. And you can look him up if you want. However, to suffice it to say, he basically lived on water and some kind of flour mixed with water for most of his life, since 10 years old. And he lived to be like 92-ish or whatever it was. So why I say that is because that's not his fault. Medicine sometimes has no answer. And that's how he lived. However, he's also given an extraordinary gift. So why I say that is because there's a lot of saints who have brutal lives and long suffering they had to endure. And they are not healed, but they keep that suffering. And as a consequence, they're able to, with Christ, heal people and help people. So, and that's one thing I want to tell you about this. So if you tend to be someone who you never considered being a Christian or whatever, or you never heard of this before, and things just happen, not your fault. You make sure it's not your fault, and you just happen to suffer all the time. Maybe talk to someone about this. Maybe you are called to be a little bit more than what you think you are. And, this is, the world doesn't like this because it's let me give you an example. I work with disabled people most of my life, and sometimes I work with paraplegics, quadriplegics, and we would go to the mall sometimes. Some people would say, well, what's the point of them living? They're suffering, They can't move, they can't walk, whatever. But yet, when we would go around the mall, it brought out the goodness in them. That's what I'm trying to say. 10% couldn't handle it, and they just walked away. They just think it was like too much for them. But about 90% of the people, and it was a great thing. So even though their life may seem purposeless and they suffered tremendously, look what they've done. They bring joy and love to others. Juxtapose that. There's certain businesses where it's all about money, and sometimes you get greed, and you get disharmony, and it brings out other things that are not good and beautiful. So that's not. Why are some healed and one are not? Again, we don't know. That's part of the mystery of God, and this is the part that's difficult, because suffering is not beautiful. It can be in a sense, but it's not. People cry. People are in pain. People are, it's not like happies. It's not, what ideally what the world wants, So, and then finally, I want to talk about the voluntary suffering or penance. Throughout the early church and even before the church, we talked about the Nineveh, and the king humbled himself and came to him to do sackcloth and ashes. Well, penance has been part of the Christian life for those who choose to do it. And this gets into a deeper spiritual aspect, and this needs to be done with guidance from a spiritual director or something. But there are times where you can, in the simple terms, you can say, I'll go without dessert and offer it up for somebody's health. Just simple things like that. I'll do the lawn today and instead of tomorrow, and because my wife will be happy, or maybe that's a son and he'll do it so he pleases parents. So he's offering something in the form of work or denying himself something. And there's other types where the whole hair cloth and other stuff, which I won't get into, that is common. Let's say it's common in history with those who are nuns and monks, and then some lay folk have done that in priests and stuff. But that's, again, you have to really need a spiritual director for that, because you want to make sure you're doing the right thing. So I hope this helped in terms of the whole idea of suffering. The main thing is it's part of the Christian way. Helps, without the cross, Christ could have come and just said, okay, everybody come up to heaven. He didn't. Why? Well, because it was clear. He had to go through the cross. He had to die. He had to die for us. And he also said, remember, those who do not take up their own cross are not his disciples. So you got to take up your own cross, whatever it is. And understand this in part of the spiritual life, because there are times when things get really tough and nobody can help. Nobody. And you basically repeat the words of Jesus, thy will be done. Not my will, but thy will be done. As you suffer and you may not make it to the next day, that's what you're trying to, the mantra, thy will be done. It's in your hands. This is, maybe someone with cancer, or someone, who, there's so many different pathologies that cause death. And then you don't know if you're going to wake up the next day. So thy will be done. And spiritual life that focuses all on God's will and his infinite mercy. Hope you enjoyed the video.